I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I am here with my colleague Yasmin Forbes. Many of you know her if you are part of our ACRE grant, and if you're not, uh, then now you get to know her, and she's really fabulous. So she is in the Atlanta area, and I am joining in from Central Florida. I did not get blown away by the hurricane. We made it out okay, so I'm happy to report that there was minimal damage here. But thank you all for being here tonight on behalf of NCHE for our webinar, Whose Stories Get Told, Art and Historical Perspectives. You're all here thanks to funding by the U.S. Department of Education, so we're very grateful to them for funding our programming. We're thrilled to have you explore how art can serve as a lens to amplify diverse voices and challenge some dominant narratives in history. So today's presenter is Cherish Christopher. She's an art educator at the Philadelphia Art Museum, and she brings over 10 years of experience. Some of you who are in the room from some of our grants who went to Philadelphia this past summer had met Cherish in person. And those of you who have not met Cherish and are part of our EDGE and ACRE grants will be going to the museum in person this summer. So you'll get to see her in real life this summer. But she's designed innovative curriculum that allows students to engage in historical narratives through artistic expression with a focus on amplifying marginalized voices. Her work's dedicated to helping students critically examine history while fostering creativity and empathy. Her approach empowers young learners to become active participants in shaping how stories are told and remembered. So we're thrilled to have her here tonight. I wanted to take an opportunity to also share about some other upcoming webinars that we have. So on October 22nd at 7:30, 6:30 Central, The War Before Independence, Contextualizing the American Revolution and Other Episodes of Early U.S. History with web maps. So if you teach geography or use geography in your history class, I'm sure you do, that might be a great one to attend. The Weimar Republic, The Rise of Nazi Germany is on October 29th with Brown University's Choices program. They have some resources they're going to share with you. On November 6th, we have Question Like a Historian, teaching students how to ask questions that drive inquiry and spark action. And then on November 7th, the very next day, we have White House 101, exploring the People's House with some people from the White House Historical Association that will be there. So feel free to check out some of those. You can register for those on our website. We also have some recordings if there's something you might want to go back and listen to. But we do hope that you enjoy today's session and will inspire you to think critically about how you can weave art into your history classroom. And thank you so much for your participation. If you have questions, there is a Q&A area at the bottom, or you can throw them in the chat. We really encourage you to keep that chat active and going as Cherish is presenting. We love to have an open dialogue. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Cherish. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction. It feels so crazy to have myself talked about in such a clinical way because I just feel like I go into the galleries and have fun, which is hopefully what I'm going to be able to do with you all today. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you all are able to see that. Welcome to today's presentation. As Shauna said, my name is Cherish Christopher. I work at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There's our gorgeous building right there. And tonight's presentation is going to be Whose Stories Get Told, Art and Historical Perspectives. Just to go over the session agenda a little bit, I'm going to do a few introductions, talk a little bit about myself. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the programs that we offer at the museum for those who are interested. And then we're going to get to the actual presentation, which is Whose Story Get Told, Art and Historical Perspective, which is sort of the meat and potatoes of tonight. And then I will have a section for questions. Now, feel free to ask me questions throughout the lesson or the presentation tonight, especially if it relates to the object itself or like teaching the object. We'll be doing a lot of close looking and inferencing observations, etc. So please feel free to unmute yourself as well. And I think like unmuting and having this conversation be a space where people feel comfortable to share out is really fun, especially because it gives the feel of being in the galleries without actually being in the gallery. I think it's a really nice way for us to build out our conversation naturally as a community, and we're learning all together, which I think is really fun too. So yeah, feel free to ask me questions. I will say any questions related to like booking and the museum itself and like knowing more about the interworkings, I would prefer if those stayed towards the end, but yeah, feel free to stop me whenever. So here's me and my lovely class. This is actually from earlier this year, even though my hair is still green and black. You can tell green is my favorite color. I'm the Sherlock Program Coordinator and a museum educator here at the museum. Sherlock is a multi-visit research-based program for our fifth, sixth, and now seventh graders. They come in 7 times throughout the year. It's a fully funded program for the teachers and the students. And it's a really fun time for us to explore critical and creative thinking. And the other part of my job is museum education, which will be sort of what you see a little bit today. We bring the students in and we have a select group of tours that we offer. And these students help familiarize the students with the museum while also talking a little bit about history and art through various different lenses. So just to quickly go over our school tours, they're sort of broken down into 2 different sections. So we have first trip to the museum, which is exactly as it sounds. It's an introduction to the museum through looking at objects and exploring the highlights of our collection. And that's also where students are really getting that first look into close looking and inquiry-based approach, inquiry-based learning as we approach art. I think our most popular one in this section is Around the World. I also think that's one that is pretty relevant to the work that you all do as history educators, because part of what we're doing on those tours is exploring the world using art as the center of that. So this one is really nice because it also serves a variety of different audiences. So as you'll see, we have a space for kindergarten and also 12th graders too. So it's really nice to scaffold, and you'll notice that the kindergartners and the younger students maybe are interested in maybe the creation and the process of art. So you get to kind of talk about that while also teaching them about the world, which is fun. Whereas older students maybe are a little bit more interested in the people and the culture, which those younger audiences get as well, but you get to have more of those in-depth conversations with them, which I always really enjoy. And then we have our Exploring Art in Depth, which is a more in-depth look into art, and you're using more of a critical lens to do so, as well as you're looking at art through a focused lens. So we have tours like Black Art, Black Voices, Mixed Media and Perspective, and Exploring Identity Through Art. And I think these are really nice ones because they kind of serve multiple different purposes. So history teachers could really benefit from using these because we, could use history at this as the center for a lot of these things. So maybe we're exploring material culture and we're looking at material culture from the 1920s and how people made art during then. For Black Art, Black Voices, maybe we want to learn about the civil rights era. And so we get to explore Blackness through the lens of civil rights, which I think is a really nice direct history curriculum connection. And then exploring identity. Here we tend to talk about a lot of like movements and protests that happened during this time, which I think a lot of teachers are really interested and talking about protest history, or even finding ways to address complex histories in their history lessons. And so I think that's another one that is really useful for history educators as well. So that was kind of a lot. I wanted to get through that really quickly. And you can ask questions if you need clarification at the end, but I really do want to get looking at some artwork because that's what you all are here to do today. So here I have an object in front of you. What we're going to do is we're going to take a couple minutes to just take a look at this object and kind of absorb what you see happening here. We're going to be doing something that the students do in the galleries, which is called object-based teaching. So as you look at this painting, I want you to start to take note of some observations that you'd like to share out later. When you feel ready, you can unmute yourself or use the chat function and sort of share out some observations that you're noticing based off of the object in front of you. So again, feel free to take a look. And then as you're ready, you can start to share out some observations that you notice about this object in front of you. So we have the word Indio and coyote up at the top. Yes, there are dark colors. Yeah. What else do you all notice about this object? Yeah. So we have food up at the front. Yeah, the color or the contrast with the shadows, and the bright colors as well, the balance. There's a family scene here, the mom and the child with the father as the provider. There are clouds in the background, and we're also noticing skin tones. For the folks who are noticing skin tones, what do you notice specifically about the skin tones that are interesting to you? Okay, here we have the woman is lighter than the baby. There's a young baby here present as well. Okay, generally look like pleasant people or happy folks. The colors are very rich. Mm. This comment here, by Lisa, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. It says the food and mother are highlighted, giving the focus to the mother and the child, and the father is secondary. I think we can totally see that, right? Especially with the positioning, with the child and how both of the parents are focusing in on the child directly. And then the mother herself, she is painted in a little bit more of a richer way, right? Like the artist definitely wants us to focus in on that scene between mother and child, which I think is really important. Multiple shades of skin tone. The mom is lighter. Some folks are asking questions about why the mom's skin is lighter. But we notice that there are various skin tones between the two of them. And I like that we're talking about the softness of this painting as well, because I think it's a really intimate, tender moment. Sandra asked what the man is holding in his hand. He's holding a piece of bread. And the mother is lighter. I don't want to spoil why the mother is lighter quite yet, but it is, I think, important to note that the mother in this painting is lighter, and there's a very clear difference in their skin tones. Here we have somebody saying that there are possibly different races. Yes, they are different races. And there are some clues that we can notice up at the top left that will help us see that. So it's in Spanish. I'll read the translated version. It says, from Indian and Mestiza, we get a coyote. Okay. Um, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what else do you all notice about this painting? Um, Seems that the baby and the dad are the same race. That's a very interesting observation. We'll put a pin in that and talk about that later. The food is also from different regions, which is also really important. Somebody asked, why is it important? Different skin tones are not surprising to me. I think the thing that'll be interesting is the way that we are interpret, like the time period in which we're interpreting the difference in race. We'll talk about that a little bit in just a second. Um, Yes. Somebody asked, is this the Spanish colonial racial hierarchy paintings? Yes, these are called Costa paintings. Let's not talk too much about them because we're going to look at another painting. I'm going to take a couple more observations. Um, Somebody asked, is the speaking feature disabled? The Zoom does not give the option to unmute. I'm not sure if that's something that we can look at
Yeah, if
or.
you want to raise your hand, we can give you permission to talk.
So if you'd rather raise your hand, there is now an option to do that too, which I would love to hear some voices, so don't be shy.
Yeah, go ahead and
Um,
raise your hand and we'll know you're ready to grab the mic.
Sherry said that this family seems very wealthy. I'm curious to know, why do you think they look very wealthy? What are some things that you notice here that helps us to see that they look very wealthy? Okay, yeah, the abundance of food for sure. Mother is not breastfeeding the baby, but rather like looking in a very like nurturing type way. So I think it's meant to sort of give the illusion of there being some of that maternal positioning of the baby. There's also a possibility that maybe she could have just finished up breastfeeding. We don't know for sure. The woman is wearing jewelry and the clothing do look very high quality. And the abundance of food too, is something that I see folks saying a lot when it comes to like the wealth of this family. Let's move on to our next slide. So what do we notice about this slide here? Colorful clothing. Okay, some people think that this could be the same lady. Okay, we have some folks that are identifying the color of their skin. Some folks are saying these could be white people, lighter skinned people. The child's focus is on the man. Child with hands raised to the cup. She also has the same mole, like near her hairline. She has jewelry. Yeah, same mole, different face. Or some people think that it looks like the same lady. The clothes are very rich, right? Not only rich in color, but definitely rich in texture too, right? There's definitely a hierarchy here between these two people. There was a comment that says she is serving the man, and we can see that in a lot of the things that she's doing. The mother is secondary, tending to the family and the food, or tending to the food and not the child. Yeah, Angelique commented on the lack of food in this one in comparison to the first object that we looked at. The crescent moon on the horse's head. Yes, thank you, Austin. And there is a horse in the background, right? Okay, Melissa said here that the child isn't integral to this painting. And Glenn said Mariska, which means Muslim, right? Mariska doesn't quite mean Muslim. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But you're not far off. Yeah, and we also see the word albino too, right? Somebody also said that this is the same background and this just flipped around. That is true, which is something that we often get as an observation in the galleries. But there are some noticeable differences, and we'll sort of talk about that in just a second. We're going to eventually compare the two of these and maybe talk about like what we see happening here. The child does look very different. Why does this child look different? What seems different about this child? Yeah, white hair, right? Very light skin and light hair. Okay, somebody thinks that this child could be older. Blonde hair, very light eyes. Yeah. He does look like a little old man. When we bring students into the galleries and you look at him like in the painting, a lot of people assume that it's like a miniature man, and they often make fun of him because of like the weird proportions in portraits like this anyway. But no, that is actually meant to be a child. Okay, Nicole says that the man is dressed in upper class clothing compared to the traditional clothing of the adults. Okay, well, Austin said not vital, but the numbers next to the titles make it seem like it's from some sort of album. I would actually argue that that is pretty vital information. And it kind of tells us that this is, of course, not, these two are not the standalones, right? You'll notice that they're numbered. And then these specific paintings, we believe that there are probably 16 of these that belonged in a series. And oftentimes when you see paintings like this, there are not just one of them, there are often a couple of them. The man does look very noble. The man is white and the woman is of another race, yes. Oh, somebody asked if the man is wearing a collar or if it's a necklace. He is actually wearing what looks like a scarf. And it may have like a metal link or something. And you'll also notice that like he's wearing like some kind of like cape like dressing over him too. So I'm not sure if that metal piece is actually connected to the cape itself or if that's like a separate attachment. But if I had to guess, it has something to do with that. Yeah, and he also has cufflinks. The focus isn't on the child, but the dynamic of the two adults. And then we had a question of, is this woman his wife or his servant? I'm going to throw that back to the audience. What do you all think? Is this his wife or his servant? Servant, servant, wife, wife for sure. Okay. Servant, servant, servant. Oh, could be a mistress, huh? Both. Leanne, are you saying both because you think that do you think that there could have been like some sort of nefarious union between the two of them, or are you commenting more on like the role that women played back during that time? She is definitely not his equal. Okay, yeah, the role of a woman, yeah. Servant he had a child with. Would the servant be wearing jewelry? That's a really would this per if she was like actually serving this man and was like bound to him in that way, would she be wearing jewelry? The answer is probably no, right? Um, let's compare the two of these. What do you guys notice between the two of them? How are each of the families interacting? Okay, they don't seem connected. If it is the same woman, oh, the comment disappeared. She seems below his station, but above the station of the other man. Okay. Maybe wearing jewelry. Okay, maybe a servant. Intimate with the first, no business, but the first one business wise with the second one. The paintings represent racial / social hierarchy. Yeah, I like this comment of the women providing care in the same way. They're both like very intimately involved in their families, right? Yeah, the first family definitely seems closer. The second one doesn't appear to have that much of a connection, right? Okay, I like this comment too. One is doting on the child and the other one is not focused on the child. First one seems to represent family unity, while the second one is more individual. First family, the father in the first family seems connected to the child, while the second one seems distant. I agree with that as well. Let's talk a little bit more about these. So earlier, I saw a lot of comments from folks sort of identifying what these paintings were. They are, or what these paintings are. These are Costa paintings. Costa paintings are paintings that sort of show racial hierarchy. We'll talk a little bit about that, but first I kind of want to go over the titles. You'll notice that on each of these paintings, right, the one on the left and the one on the right, the one on the left says, "From Indian and Mestizo come Coyote," right? And the one on the right side says, "From Spaniard and Morisca comes Albino." Just to define some of those terms, Indian would be someone of indigenous lineage or indigenous heritage. Whereas mestiza represents somebody with Spanish heritage and indigenous heritage. When we go over to the right side, we see "From Spaniard and Morisca come Albino." This man here, who is the Spaniard, is somebody of European descent, of Spanish descent, whereas the woman here, Morisca, is somebody of Spanish descent as well as African descent. So what we're seeing here, especially to the comment earlier of somebody asking if Morisca translates to Muslim, it's not Muslim, but this woman is from probably an area in North Africa where Islam would have been a very popular religion there. So I think that there could have been some tie-in with that. What these paintings are showing is intermixing of races during this time, which was it was becoming somewhat common in that area because there were folks that were settling in this place. but it then ramped up even more once Spain took control of this area that we know of as New Spain. So this is like an area in Mexico where the Spanish had came and settled. And what these paintings were hoping to do was promote a racial hierarchy. The Spaniards created this racial caste system that placed them up at the top of the caste system. They are like the ones that are in the highest control here in this area. They're the ones that everybody wants some sort of access to because they have the most privilege in the society. And then everybody else is kind of broken off into different subcategories. With this right painting, well, let me ask you first before I say, who do you think, now that you have a little bit more of that context, which family do you think is like the wealthier family, or the one that has like the most privilege during this time? Yeah, the family on the right, for sure. Yeah. Um, Yeah, the one with the older child. Right. So the family on the right side is actually the family that has more access and wealth. Coyote, as there was a comment over here, does indicate a lower hierarchy for this family over here on the left side where you see Coyote at. And so the Spaniards were creating photos like portraits like this and sending them back to Europe because when the leaders in Spain looked back at these images, what they saw was Spaniards coming into this like uncivilized, unstructured society and building in a structure. And it's also a structure that like directly favors the Spaniards in this area. And so you can imagine why these very wealthy settlers were here trying to get these photos commissioned. The other thing that I wanted to point out too is, as I said, these are not just one of the of its own kind. There are various of them, and I think for the ones that we have in our collection, we believe that there are 16 of them. And these are really interesting to look at with students because first of all, they like notice the difference in like the food that's present there. They also can tell that there is a very clear wealth gap here, but they're not sure which family may not be the wealthier family and which family is the wealthier family. Oftentimes they go to the family on the left side because what they see is all of that food there and there's a little bit more warmth in the family. And so I think in their head, they assume, oh, okay, well, the family on the left side must be the family that's richer because they are a warmer family with one another and they have all this harvest on the table. And then they're shocked when we actually tell them, well, the harvest on the table could actually be an indicator of this family actually not having as much money, especially when you take into account the father's skin complexion, which means that he probably would have been working in the fields, collecting this harvest, putting it in these baskets, and then maybe selling it at a market to make money. Yeah, yeah. A lot of people are saying that they also were thinking the same thing. See, Lisa has raised her hand. Lisa, I think you should be able to speak if you would like to talk. I'm not sure if that was an accident or not. Maybe it was. All right. Yeah, so as we can see that there is a very clear difference in the racial hierarchy, and there are those subtle details that help us to see that there is that big difference. And I think the difference is really hard to parse out for students, because this is like such a different time, right? It just looks very different. But also, our idea of wealth now is different than what the idea of wealth was back then. Right now we see a wealthy person, and maybe a way that we're able to tell that they're wealthy is because they have a lot of something, right? Like a lot of cars or like a lot of different things in their house, a lot of really decorative objects. Whereas back then it wasn't necessarily about what they had, like it wasn't about the amount, it was like what the product actually was. Whereas like here they do have a lot of harvest, but again, that was like the poor man's job to work the land, which is why we have this father here with a darker skin complexion. Whereas over here on the right side, we notice that there are different indicators here that are a little more subtle that help us to see that the family on the right is wealthier. First and foremost, it would be the horse in the back, especially with like that decorative emblem on their head with the lunar symbol turned down. And then also the father is dressed in very traditional European clothing. And they're not just European clothing, which shows that there is wealth there because he is of European descent. It's also the texture of the fabric and how high quality everything looks. Yeah, exactly. The velvet indicates wealth. Like it looks like there is a bit more money spent on those types of materials in that fabric. Another thing that I wanted to call out too is the dishes and the ceramics that the family on the right side has. Even though the family on the left side, again, has more bounty on their table, it's not actually as bountiful when you are looking at the fact that there are no dishes there in comparison to the family on the right that has an abundance of dishes. And then even down to the women and the way that they're dressed in a very similar way. A lot of people wonder if this was like a stylistic thing back then. We're not actually totally sure if it was stylistic or if that's just like who the artist had available to model for them, but you can tell that they wanted to show that these women were different, especially in the texture of the clothes. It just looks a little bit more wealthy. A lot of the times when students come into the museum, they're very curious as to why we're talking about New Spain and Spaniards it when we come to the museum and we're talking about American history, but it's also because we are trying to expand their worldview a little bit and make a lot of global connections. One thing that was asked to do for this presentation is to link in the Habits of Mind curriculum that you all have or like standards that you have. And one that really stuck out to me is historical empathy and being able to discern differences between evidence and assertion. Or sorry, my notes are a little all over the place. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Historical empathy is rather than like viewing things from or no, I'm sorry, viewing things from the past with the mindset that you would use back then, rather than applying your present mindness to it. And it works in a lot of different ways. I think one of the best ways that it works is being able to have students like think about something critically and maybe see multiple different viewpoints. Some viewpoints may be harder to sit in, but I do think it's important for them to be able to see a wide variety of different perspectives. And I think another way that that really benefits us too is that we're able to take a look back at this and maybe interpret how people would have felt while looking at these things, especially if you belonged to a racial identity or had a racial identity that put you down lower on the totem pole, right? So then we're able to be this family and think like, yes, they do have these like intimate moments happening amongst them, but we also know that these are people that probably were not favored in society. And even if you look at more Costa paintings done by other artists, you'll see even more stereotypical perspectives on the way that these people lived. And I think if you're thinking about how, again, this relates to American history, we're seeing the development of a racial caste system that is still relevant today, especially if you're thinking about the experiences of Black and Brown students or like immigrant students and the way that they're perceived in society. They are then experiencing the world in the way that or not necessarily in the direct way, but very similarly to the way that folks may have experienced society back in the day, especially when you're thinking about the types of stereotypes and stuff that were associated with different groups of people. I think one that's very relevant today and sometimes that we have students talk about is the whole Haitian immigrants eating pets thing. A lot of the time students come in and they make comments like that. And I think being able to show them something like this, where we can kind of directly see that there are maybe negative perceptions of people during this time that still have some like weight today. It's really nice to be able to deconstruct the types of categories and stuff that folks are automatically putting people in, especially as a young, be able to introduce that intervention on like stereotypes based off of what they hear about certain people, and getting them in the habit of being able to just look at people for who they are, rather than all the boxes that they can be fit into. Yeah, exactly. Great point, Kimberly. Students don't realize that they're looking at it from a modern perspective until you point it out. Exactly. I'm not gonna, we'll talk about that in just a second. I just want to see if there are any other comments about here or this object. Doesn't look like it. In the interest of time, we'll move on to our next object. Here is the next object that we're going to be looking at. So again, just as we did with the first object, go ahead and take a look, and you can share out your observations as you have them. I think portraits are a little bit harder to interpret just because they feel like there's not a whole lot to see. But one thing I will say is there is a lot to see. You just kind of have to look at it with your system one thinking rather than your system two thinking. System one is just being able to identify things and like call it as you see it, whereas system two is maybe you trying to like then figure out what all those different pieces mean. So it's like the difference between being able to observe and interpret. Yeah, his jacket is very colonial American. He's wearing 3 layers of clothing, his skin tone, oversized clothing, his unique hat shape. He's wearing a leather coat. He has kind eyes. Somebody said, my man's is happy. He does look very happy. Very strong features, right? I think especially in like the eyebrows and around like his jaw, it's very defined. He's looking directly at the viewer. Smirking, almost smiling. He looks very satisfied. I would agree. What else do we notice? Older, he has white hair. Again, looking satisfied. The clothes look well made. The picture does kind of look a little modern. Why do you say it looks modern, Sherry? The portrait, not a scene. Yeah. He is very stylish, yeah. Which could maybe show that it's a little bit more of a modern piece. He is a very maybe average looking person, gives off a peaceful vibe. His face is very thin, which I think kind of speaks to his old age, right? Consumed by clothing. I like that. He does have a lot of clothes on. Like he's wearing that big heavy leather jacket and then another jacket underneath, and then it looks like there's even more stuff underneath. It does like it's a bee. It does look like it's a beanie, but it's not actually a beanie. It's a kufi, which you'll maybe some of you all are familiar with it. It's a hat that is worn traditionally by African Muslim men. So that helps, kind of paint a picture of what his identity is. It's spelled Kufi. Yeah, the painting of his face is very precise. It does look a lot like a photograph. It could be to hide his thinness. Those are all of his possessions, yes. This portrait was painted in 1819. Now, you don't have to know a whole lot about art to know, like, it's pretty uncommon for us to see a portrait of a Black man from 1819, right? Especially a portrait as, like, well defined and as, like, intricate and detailed as this one is, right? So why do we think maybe this person is distinguished from other people who may be like closely related to him in some way? I'm thinking, I guess a more simplified way to ask that question is like, why is he, the chosen one to be in this like really fancy portrait? What makes him different or special? Wealthy or a significant individual? Okay, is there a relationship between artist and poser? That is a really good observation, and it does relate a bit. Save someone's life, maybe he's royalty, maybe a respected elder. Maybe he's a leader of some sort. Yeah. there is definitely a particular care taken in this portrait. I 100% agree with you. Maybe important to the family. This is a portrait of Yaro Mahmoud. Here you'll notice Mamadou Yaro. That was his name, his Muslim name from when he lived. And portrait was painted by Charles Wilson Peel in 1819. So a lot of you guys kind of identified some reasons why this person is pretty significant. And it's for a couple different reasons. First of all, he was important to Charles Wilson Peel. And the reason why he was important to them is because he was an enslaved person that then was able to sort of buy his own freedom once he was freed. And then after he was freed, he bought his son's freedom and he moved and established a really nice, healthy community for himself and his family. And so here, you'll notice to the side where it says that he endured 45 years of enslavement, gained his freedom, purchased his son's freedom, bought a house, and held stock in bank. And he was devoted to the Muslim faith and was also literate in both Arabic and English. And so Charles Wilson Peel was traveling all around the world during this time, specifically in the United States, in the area where Yaro lives. He was enslaved in the Maryland area, and then later moved further north with his family. And when Charles Wilson Peel found out about him, he was so fascinated and interested in his story. He then drove down to paint him. And that's why there's such detail. And I think, like care, as somebody said, and like intimacy in this portrait. He is a very significant person just because he was able to really establish something for himself after enduring 45 years of enslavement. I think if you're thinking about the way that enslavement is taught in schools and the way that a lot of students learn about it, one thing you'll notice is that it's often a story that is like filled with like heaviness, especially because we know a lot of people lost their lives and weren't able to live as peacefully as Yaro was. And so I think this is a very important portrait for a couple different reasons. During this time, portraits were only painted by very, very, very wealthy people. And Yaro having a portrait here signals to us that he is a very like wealthy person, but also that he was an important person during this time. And I think being able to see important Black figures during this time that live differently than, or not even live differently, but challenges our idea of what a Black person during this time may have experienced, I think is really important. Now, does that mean that every person was walking around like Yaro? Absolutely not. But Yaro is a very important person that I think offers another perspective to enslavement for students. Let me just take a second to take a look at the chat. Somebody pointed out that he has an American clothing, but an African hat. And I think that kufi is meant to symbol to us that he is still very dedicated to his African heritage and also his religion too, especially if you think about enslavement. Like a lot of enslaved people had to abandon their own individual religions and ideals to adopt that of, their masters. And so I think it's really important that Yaro is here depicted with this kufi, and I think that that was an intentional thing on his end, and also maybe Charles Wilson Peel's end as well. Yeah, exactly, Frank. This is significant because it shows Muslims were in America very early in our history, not a new phenomenon, as some would want to believe. Exactly. I also think it expands maybe or challenges our view of who a Muslim person is. I had a group of ninth graders come in, and one of them chose to do a paper or respond back to this portrait of Yaro because he himself was Muslim and he didn't know that like enslaved people were Muslims, or that there were Black Muslims during that time. And so it was a very interesting moment where somebody like me, somebody who's a social historian, I'm like, of course, yes, there were Black Muslims out there. But I think from the perspective of a child that is now being told new information, we're exploring different viewpoints, right? And again, back to making global connections. And I even think the idea of students being global citizens, being able to bridge that gap even a little bit for him, I'm sure changed his perspective on maybe the Black Muslims that he sees walking around, especially in a city like Philadelphia, where we have a huge population of Black Muslims. Yeah, free Black man in the early 1900s. Yeah, you'll see here again, he was enslaved for 45 years before he was able to purchase his freedom. Yeah. Yarrow is a very, very, very cool person, and it's also a very fun portrait to teach. And this is one where I think earlier today, as I mentioned, with like specific stereotypes that are ascribed to certain groups based off of their racial identity, especially, Yarrow is often clocked as a home. People often associate Yarrow with being a homeless man. Why do we think that may be? Maybe how thin he is, the layers of clothes. The oversized clothes, yep. Yeah. Not just the layer of clothes and also the thinness in his face, but also it helps paint a little bit of a picture of the way that they view people right now, right, in their present mindness of like somebody who would look like Yarrow on the street today. Back then, right, if we're looking at this from the perspective or through the lens of like 1819, maybe we see this and we're like, okay, Yarrow has like multiple layers of clothing on and he's wearing this hat because he wants to show off his possessions and there's something that's really important to him, right? Whereas maybe right now they see Yarrow and they associate him with being a homeless person because that's kind of like maybe all they know from their perspective of like interacting with folks that may look like Yarrow. And this is where I kind of like enter into an interesting spot as an educator because of course they mean no malicious intent behind what they're saying, but I also think it's important to challenge things like that when you hear them. And I also think this portrait does two things at once. It helps create dialogue for the way that we categorize people and the way that we view people. But it also is a really important moment to introduce multiple perspectives, especially as we're teaching American history, which one of the reasons why I even wanted to become a history teacher to begin with is because I think it's so important for people to see themselves represented in history in various ways, right? If we only teach that Black people were enslaved during this time, and that is really the only identity that Black folks had then imagine the type of individual narrative and identity that Black students are creating when they're listening to all these different stories. So again, by introducing objects like this, you're offering students a different perspective and teaching them a little bit more about the complex history that existed not only in the world, but specifically in America. Yeah. He does look distinguished in that piece. I definitely think that is the case as well. Yarrow was very old when he went to go see him. He was rumored to be 140 years old, though he was only probably around 83. I think people thought he was much older because he looks a little older. But yeah, he was an older guy, but like not much older because at the time, Peele would have been 77 when he was painting Yarrow. So not that much of a difference at all. Okay. We have one more object that we'll look at tonight, and we probably won't go too much into this one just because I want to make sure I can answer questions, and we can kind of do a little bit of a wrap up. What do you all notice about this object in front of us? Oh, Edwin, to answer your question, um, Yarrow Mahmoud was his like more Western name, whereas Mamadou Yarrow was his like Muslim name. So it's spelled differently, but it's because one of them would have essentially they belong to two different the names belong to different cultures. The Dutch and Native Americans, child with animals, typically dangerous, wild animals and farm animals surrounding the child. Yeah, there are farm animals and wild animals. It is religious in tone, yes. Riddle-like writing, friends and foes, child hugging the lion. Yes, an overall message of peace. Yeah, William Penn attempted more peaceful relations with Native people than the average English colonizer. Interesting. Animals are submissive to the white child. In the background, you see Native Americans and maybe colonists. It's almost as if the child is safer with the wild animals than what is to come. Yep, a boat in the water. Are some of the people from that boat? Yes, you are right. Some of those people are from that boat. The native folks under the tree are naked. I think it's important to share that the person who made this was a white person. So this is not, we don't know for sure if this is historically accurate in terms of the way that they were dressed, but we do know that typically depictions of Indigenous folks like this are rooted in the stereotype of Indigenous folks being savages, right? Like not having clothes on. So I think it's important to remember that as you're viewing this object, because I mean, we'll talk about this in just a second, but this is a very problematic depiction of the Indigenous folks for a variety of different reasons. Innocence and purity in the child, yes. It does look like they're split into different seasons. I definitely agree, right? Like on the right side, I would say it feels more like fall or winter, whereas on the left side, there's like more like spring. Feels a little warmer too. Yeah, I like that you pointed that out, Kelly. Savage beasts might refer to both the wild animals and the Native Americans. Yeah, so at the top it says the leopard with the harmless child laid down, and not one savage beast was seen to frown. Yeah. Savage beast actually refers to the Native Americans in this painting. So it's almost like the animals are protecting her from the quote unquote savage beasts, which are again the portrayals of Indigenous folks back then. The child is more vibrant. The child is more vibrant because this is a religious painting. Like the painting has some religious undertones. Oh no, sorry about that, guys. Oh, 1 second. Oh, wow, they really don't want us. There we go. Okay. So yeah, as I said before, it has a little bit of a religious undertone to it. And there is a verse here from Isaiah 11 and 11, 6 and 9. And it's a verse that talks about peace. So earlier today, or in the comments, somebody mentioned that this is meant to, it's an overall tone of peace. This object is called the Peaceable Kingdom. And it is a narrative or yeah, I guess it's Edward Hicks's narrative or idea of what happened between William Penn and the Indigenous folks that lived in this area. So here, somebody said this earlier too, that William Penn is known for having more of a peaceful relationship with Indigenous folks. The Lenape people are native to this area. And as you see here in the text on the side, it says that they were moved and displaced from this area to the Midwest. And by the time Hicks had painted this image, we knew that like the relationship that we thought William Penn had with Indigenous folks wasn't actually the type of relationship that he had. A little bit more complex than that. He wasn't actually as nice as we thought that he was. And so here we're seeing Hicks's interpretation of that. Hicks was also a Quaker, just like William Penn was. And so this like Bible undertone and this religious undertone, I think is meant to draw connections between Hicks and Penn, or yeah, Penn. And I guess show a little bit more of Penn's, I guess, what's the word I'm thinking of? I guess how much of a peaceful person he was, but beyond peace, I think reconciler. At least that's how people saw him. And so I think now in our galleries, we're having a really interesting, or I guess difficult time, I should say, trying to figure out how to interpret Penn. Yeah, faithful. That's a really good word to use. Yeah. How to interpret William Penn, because we know that maybe he didn't have the best intentions when he was interacting with Indigenous folks, and also how we use images like this to not only shed light on the experiences of Indigenous folks during this time, but also, I guess, have more of an in-depth critical conversation on what it must have been like for these white colonizers, what a peaceful relationship between these white colonizers and these Indigenous folks actually looks like. The child taming the animal symbolizes the European belief that they, Europeans, tame the natives who live there. Yes, exactly. Right. So it's meant to show this like dual relationship here. This child is like taming these like wild animals, right? And even if they're not wild animals, we have like animals, period. And then over here, just across the way, we have these like Europeans that are kind of taming or teaching these indigenous folks the beliefs of Europeans who are viewing this interaction from a lens of like, wow, we're saving these people. Yeah, dominion over the animals. And then we're seeing an interesting dynamic in the back happen where the Europeans are also having, they have dominion over the savages that we see back there. We have a 5-minute time check. I wanted to share one more thing before I exit out, and then we can have a little bit. Yeah, the lion and the lamb thing is biblical, Isaiah 11:6. Yep. And that is the Bible verse that's actually quoted in this resource, which I'm going to share with you all next. So you'll notice that my next slide here is American Art from 1650 to 1850. This is a classroom resource that we have created for teachers like you all to use in your classroom. And there are various different curriculum connections that you can make based off of the objects here. Not only do you have objects here that you can introduce to your students to use in your classroom, but there are also close looking questions and information from the museum's collection that helps contextualize these objects for your students in the classroom. So I have a downloaded digital version that I have passed on to Shauna, so then she can pass it to you all. You can have that available too. Go ahead and stop sharing. So if you all have questions, feel free to ask questions. I know we have like a little Q&A here too, so I want to make sure I get to those as well.
Thank you so much, Cherish. This was such great information and
Yeah.
just fantastic. So we had a question right at the beginning, and it's a deep one. So are you ready for that?
Yes.
Okay. So one of our participants said he just read an article on how developing nations are demanding that their artifacts be returned. And the counter argument is that these countries do not have the resources to handle that. So, as a museum employee, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that is what we call repatriation. And so you're right. There are a lot of like folks from various countries that are demanding their objects be returned back to them. I think a good example of that would be, well, actually, we have one that was pretty close to home. The Penn Museum, they're an archaeological museum. They collect objects and artifacts that are related more to people rather than to artwork itself. And they got into a lot of trouble because there are actually remains that they had in their collection that belonged to enslaved children. And they were asked to return the remains back to the families in which they belong to. Another example of that would be Cambodian artifacts at the Met that are asked to be returned back to them. There's a woman that went to the Met and she actually prayed to the object that they had in their collection, and she was banned from the Met because she touched them and she wasn't supposed to. And so I think personally for me, especially when we're thinking about the way that objects and stuff are collected, I think it's really important for us to be sensitive to these objects and remember what they were actually used for. We have an Indian temple in our collection that was actually smuggled from India by a really rich couple here in Philadelphia and brought to the museum and then sold to the museum. They smuggled it out in pieces. And so when people come to the museum, they see this and it's seen as like a piece of fine art rather than what the object actually is, which is probably something that would have been used for prayer or for some sort of like, I guess, like blessing. And so for me, especially as somebody who identifies as a social historian, like I think it's really important for people to be able to have their objects returned back to them because we're viewing these objects through a Western lens. And so there's only so much that we'll be able to understand about those objects. Whereas the folks where the people that the objects actually belong to, they're able to use them in a way that is more effective for them. And I think that we could always just be more sensitive. So I'm very pro those objects belong back to the people that they were taken from, especially because they were acquired in very unethical ways.
Thank
Hopefully
you.
that answered the question.
Yes, that was a very deep question. So I appreciate you answering that. Are there other questions that we can answer? We've got a hot minute left, but we'd love to answer any questions that you have. And if we didn't get to your questions, I'm sure we could email those to Cherish and she could answer some of those as well. Any other questions before we close out for the evening?
And I just put my email in the chat too. So if there are things that you want to email me, you can feel free to take that. Shoot me an email. I love having conversations like this, so don't be shy.
All right. Well, thank you all. This was such a great active group, and we loved your active participation. And thank you for providing us with such great sources that we could take the time to interact with. So thank you again. We will hang out for a few minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at an in-person event through NCHE or at one of our upcoming webinars. Thanks so much, everyone.